Thrilled to see you here. Thanks for braving the weather and the ice and the slush for this evening. For those of you in the back who are standing and want to sit, don't be shy. There are plenty of seats up front. So thank you for coming for what we believe is a very important and timely show. When Moshe Katz, who was on the board of the Federation, first told Molly, our curator, and I about the collection that Kevin and Meg Kinney had, our interest was piqued. It was during the midst of the pandemic, and we hadn't been out of our homes in a very long time. We put on our masks, we went over to their lovely home and had an outstanding afternoon with the Kinneys. So we want to thank them for their donation, their time, and their energy. We also received loans from a number of other organizations and individuals, an anonymous individual, John Shannon and Jan Sir, who are here tonight from Guardian Art. UW Milwaukee, the Haggerty, Milwaukee Art Museum, UW Whitewater, and Beloit College. So thank you to all of our alumni. Exhibits like this live up to our promise to use Jewish history, culture, and values to build bridges between diverse communities. In this case, we look at those with mental illness, Romas, Blacks, and Socialists, as they were all subjugated to Hitler's culture wars and his insidious crimes. The exhibit also offers us an opportunity to highlight the second part of our vision, which is to explore contemporary topics through the lens of Jewish history. Please take time and share your thoughts on the contemporary parallels. You can do that in the Tell Your Own Story booth or in the journal located in the Special Exhibits Gallery. We want to hear from you. There are so many other people to thank for the exhibit and the related program. First, to our members, and there's a number of you here, you are at the heart of what we do. Your generous support ensures that we can continue to put on exhibits and programs like this. So thank you so much. To the board and staff of the museum, thank you for all you do. This exhibit required an immense amount of research, significant writing and editing, design and logistics, not to mention curriculum development, docent training, community program design and logistics, and so much more. Thank you to Molly Dubin, our curator, Dan Humshield, our education director, Cassie Stackett, our operations and archives manager, Jay Highland, our archivist, and Josh Bish, who was your bartender tonight, but is also our receptionist and our social media and customer service guru. A big round of applause to our friends at the Holocaust Education Resource Center, Samantha, Sam, and Michael, who are here with us tonight. They gave generously of their time and of their knowledge to help us with this exhibit. Thank you so much. For every exhibit we put together, we have an exhibit committee that helps form our programming and gives us input into the exhibit. This one was no different. So thank you to our extraordinary and involved committee, Nancy Kennedy Barnett, Rachel Baum, Kevin Kinney, Jeff Sidlow, and Linda Frank. And we also had two members from PERC, Michael Morris and Samantha Abramson. Thank you so much. And then to our donors, this is a list. Rico Fund, Harry Kaufman Family Foundation, the Anonymous Foundation, Linda and Eli Frank, the Robert L. and Dolores Schlossman Family of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, Alan and Susan Seelig, the Harvey E. and Harriet V. Vick of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, Catholic Financial Life. I would really love to thank thank them. They are underwriting, bringing all the students into this exhibit.
Whoa.
Susie Ettinger, Jonathan and Marjorie Margolis, the Milwaukee Arts Board, Wisconsin Arts Board, Nancy Kennedy Barnett and Jim Barnett family, Rachel Baum, the Brewers Community Foundation, Leslie Hayes, Dorothy Inbush Foundation, Kevin and Meg Kinney, Pam Krieger, Rhonda Pelk, the Nathan and Esther Peltz Holocaust Education Resource Center, Plotkin family, Milton and Bess Schwartz, and their children Barb, Debbie, Sandy, and Cindy, Jason Stigman and Dory Franco Stigman, the University of Wisconsin Sam and Helen Stahl Center for Jewish Studies. And our media sponsor, WHAD, Wisconsin Public Radio. Thank you, thank you, thank you for making this. When you get a chance after the talk, we'll have 2 tours, but I hope you can take in the design. And a huge thanks to our installation and design team. Their work, I think, is truly inspired. So Red Budsberg, he's a co-founder of Current Projects, and his team, Christian Franchik, Reese Rousseau, Alec Regan, Joe Thrasher, Ava Hager, and the painters. My husband, who does it for free, Greg Sisler, Seth Terhar, Alex Neenan, and finally to an intern who did some of the research for us, Travis Catalano. Thank you too to our graphic designer, Dan Fleming, who I think you agree his designs perfectly captured both the art and the history of this subject. To artists Della Wells and Jeff Simple, who will be working with Milwaukee schools to create collages representative of the art and messaging in the exhibit, but framed around contemporary issues. And to all the docents who are studying this important time period and who will lead thousands of children and adult groups to find their own special connection to the exhibit. Please join me in thanking everyone. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Peter Staudenmaier. Did I pronounce that correctly, Peter?
Close enough.
Okay. He's an associate professor of modern German history at Marquette University, where he teaches courses on Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and the history of race and racism. He's born and raised in Milwaukee, but spent several years living in Germany. Much of his research centers on the intellectual and cultural history of the Weimar and Nazi eras. He has published extensively on anti-Semitism, fascism, and the far-right movements. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Staudenmaier.
So we're good like this? Can you hear me? Even in the back, awesome, thank you. Thanks so much to the Jewish Museum for hosting this very special event. Thank you to all of you for making it out on a classic blustery Wisconsin evening. The museum staff have really been working hard. I know that. I was here earlier this week to make this exhibit possible, and I'm grateful that they've asked me to be part of it. That's a real honor. The exhibit is a treasure for Milwaukee. It is rare to find this many works of this quality together in one place. It's really rare. So we are fortunate. We can be thankful to the donors, a couple of whom are here, who have lent them, and to the curators who have taken care in assembling the display and providing crucial historical context. It is not an easy history to present, and I think they've done an exemplary job in a really, really challenging topic. So you are all in for a treat. And some of you I know I watched were looking at the art upstairs, but for those who haven't, once you have a chance to experience the art upstairs, it is really something. And tell your friends, the exhibit is here until June, and we want to have as many people as possible have the opportunity to come and see it for themselves. I have been asked to talk with you tonight about the Weimar Republic. That's the period in German history between the end of World War I in 1918 and the beginning of the Third Reich in 1933. Before that relatively brief period, roughly 14 years, Germany had a functioning democracy, its first democracy, and it was one that carried considerable hopes. That democratic Germany, the Weimar Republic, was the source of many of the artworks in the exhibit. There's other artworks that came from elsewhere, but that's where a lot of them came from. Just as important, the Weimar Republic was also an object of hatred and contempt for the Nazis. And the exhibit does a tremendous job of showing you both sides of that equation. Hence the title of my talk. My talk is called Weimar Culture, Promise and Precariousness. And both parts of that title matter. The promise of Weimar was real, and the precariousness, of course, was also just as real. To understand what I mean, I want to point out how important it is not to look at the history of the Weimar era backwards from its endpoint. We know that the Weimar Republic didn't last. We know that the Nazis came to power in 1933, destroyed the Republic, dismantled the democracy. We know how the story ends. But nobody living through the Weimar years in the 1920s knew any of those things. Those things hadn't happened yet. For them, 1933 was the future. That sounds strange because for us, it's the past. That wasn't the case in the 1920s. Think about our situation in Wisconsin right now. Wherever you stand politically, we have no idea who's going to win the Supreme Court race in April, a couple of months from now. We don't know who's going to win the presidential election next year. And that's just next year. That's 1 year from now. A German living in 1924 or a German living in 1928, they had no way of knowing what was going to happen in 1933. Now, to be clear, I do not say any of this to let anybody off the hook. There were Nazis in 1924. There were Nazis in 1928. What I am saying is that people who lived through the Weimar era, Germans or non-Germans, artists or non-artists, Jews or non-Jews, they couldn't see the future any more than we can. They had hopes and expectations and dreams about the future, and they had anxieties and trepidations and fears about the future. What they didn't have was certainties. I want us to keep that in mind. Let's not pretend that the Weimar Republic was doomed from the start, because it wasn't. It was a flawed democracy, to be sure, but it was a brave democracy, and it had a fighting chance. Those who supported the Republic, and only roughly half of Germans supported the Republic while it was there, but those who supported the Republic, they didn't give up on it just because it had powerful and valuable enemies. They did their best to try to make democracy work, even when the odds didn't look so good. So that is the background to the astonishing cultural revival that we now look back on, because for us it's the past, that we now look back on as Weimar Germany. That's what kept that cultural revival going. Weimar was a laboratory of social transformation in the midst of economic instability. It was both an inspiring experiment in democracy and a cautionary tale about political fragmentation. All of the contradictions of modern society seem to come together in this one country at the same time in both positive and negative ways. And that led to a situation that was, artistically speaking, extraordinarily fertile, but political terms was highly volatile. And I want us to look at that promise and precariousness from three different angles. I'll try to go through them pretty quickly here so we have some time for discussion. The first is to look at the urban landscape. of Weimar society, a society that had an urban-rural divide in some ways not so different from our own today. Even though the Weimar Republic was named after the town of Weimar, that's where its constitution was written, the capital of the Republic was Berlin. Berlin then, as now, was the largest city in Germany. In the 1920s, Berlin wasn't just the largest city in Germany. In the 1920s, Berlin was the third largest city in the world. I'll say that again to let that sink in. In the 1920s, Berlin was the third largest city in the world. That's a big deal. It was often seen, this will get a little controversial, this is arguable. It was often seen as the global center of modernism and the arts. Some of you will defend the honor of Paris here. Arguably, Berlin was ahead of Paris, ahead of New York. Aside from Berlin, German cities like Munich, like Frankfurt, like Leipzig, like Dresden, like Hamburg, had very lively cultural scenes of their own. They were metropolises in their own right. And then we have cities like Vienna and Zurich, neither one of them in Germany, but predominantly German-speaking cities with famous avant-garde scenes of their own. These were multicultural cities. They had divergent communities that came from all over the place in multiple senses. They had communities, many of whom were very recently rural and only just moved into urban spaces. Some of them came from places far beyond Germany's borders and had only recently emigrated to Germany, different languages, different customs, different religious practices, all learning about one another side by side in rapidly growing and rapidly modernizing cities. You might say that the experience of walking down a street in a city, any city in Weimar, Germany, and hearing the sounds and seeing the sights, you might say that that was a brand new experience in human history, that there was a new phenomenon that people had not experienced before. And when that sort of thing happens, it is simultaneously both utterly unsettling, this has never happened before in all of human evolution, but it's also the kind of thing that can stir up some pretty powerful creative energy among artists. The second angle I would like us to take a look at is, what does democracy even mean? What did it mean to different constituencies during the Weimar Republic? I want us to look at the contested meanings plural, the contested meanings of democracy at a time when democracy itself was embattled, to say the least. And the simple version of this history, to my chagrin, a very widespread version of this history, the simple version of this history is that the political center in the Weimar Republic supported democracy, and the extremes on the left and right undermined it, pardon me. Now that version makes a little bit of sense, but it stops making sense the closer you look at it. For one thing, we have to thank the left at the very beginning of the Weimar era for making democracy possible in the first place. That's a complicated history. It gets messy. I won't bore you with the details, but that's basically the history there. It was the fact that the left in Germany in 1918 and 1919 opted for democracy, including large stretches of the radical left. That's what made it possible to have a democracy of some kind in Germany. And on the right, it was just as complicated and just as messy. I study the right, so I pay a lot of attention to those complications and messiness. The right was severely divided internally in the Weimar era, divided among itself about what they opposed in the Republic, if they opposed the Republic, about what they wanted to replace it with. But probably the most fundamental disagreements concerned what democracy was all about, what its proper place was in Germany. Many on the left pushed for what they called, or what they saw as more substantive forms of democracy, where people would participate in everyday ways in making decisions about their own collective affairs, instead of letting have a small group of representative people who lived in a faraway city do that for them. Many on the right, in contrast, viewed democracy as basically un-German. They viewed democracy as a foreign system that was imposed on Germany after the defeat in World War I, and they saw it as incompatible with German traditions of loyalty, of honor, and of respect for authority. Now that divide eventually proved insurmountable. But just to give you a sense of how difficult it could be, even at the simplest practical level, how difficult it could be just to form a working coalition in the parliament, the national parliament, the national legislature during the Weimar years. Here's a quick electoral statistic for you. In the 1928 Reichstag elections, many of you will think of, when you hear the word Reichstag, you'll think of the building, which is where the national legislature met. That's true. That's also called the Reichstag. But the Reichstag was also the name for the legislature itself, a bunch of the several hundred members of the legislative body, the parliament, that met in that building. In the 1928 Reichstag elections, totally normal elections, scheduled. I did not choose the statistic because it's wacky. I chose it because it's normal. It's representative of how Weimar democracy, for better or worse, functioned. In the 1928 Reichstag elections, there were 41 parties on the ballot. Think of that the next time you go into vote on your ballot. 41 parties represented. This is the national elections. 41 parties on the ballot. 14 of them won seats in the Reichstag that year. 6 of those won a substantial number of seats. So for that Reichstag session, lasted 2.5 years or so, there were 6 main parties and 8 minor ones. Now we think in 2023 that it's really hard to govern because one party's in control of the House and another party's in control of the Senate. Try doing that with 14 different parties. A little reminder for you there of what it actually meant to try to have a functioning democracy under those conditions. Okay, the third and last angle I'm going to ask us to consider is to step back for a minute from the level of party politics and parliamentary concerns and to look at the Weimar Republic as an expanding space of freedom for larger and larger segments of society. Germany in the 1920s, and especially German cities in the 1920s, these were centers of social innovation, new gender roles, new forms of sexual expression, new living arrangements, new types of work, new types of clothing, new types of transportation, of entertainment, of course, new kinds of art. There were international influences. I know I'm talking about Germany, but they were borrowing heavily, and I mean international. I don't just mean France and Russia and other European countries, around the entire world, multiracial influences, a cosmopolitan and curious atmosphere. What working class people could do and say in public, what women could do and say in public, those things broadened significantly in the Weimar years. Spaces opened up for people who weren't heterosexual, people who didn't really fit neatly into any of the available sexual categories. Those spaces were limited, but they existed. All of this cumulatively had an intensely liberating effect for countless individuals in a country with a famously authoritarian and restrictive past. Whatever else we might say about Weimar's failings, that is worth remembering. Now we can see all of that and more reflected in Weimar art. Those tumultuous years witnessed this profusion of artistic creativity, right in the midst of all the economic and political upheaval and uncertainty. If you look at some of those works upstairs, if you look at them, you can see traces of both the democratic potential and the authoritarian reaction. You can see the empowerment of previously excluded groups. You can see traces of the discovery of new scientific frontiers. You can see the ways that Weimar filled Germans with hope and with dread. Both of those things, I think, come through clearly in those artworks. Look at some of the figurative works, just as an example. Look at some of the works that depict human forms, singly or collectively. There's a lot of them upstairs that fit into that category. You will notice the entire range of human emotional experience etched into those faces. You will see exuberance, joy, vitality, but you'll also see anguish and despair and loathing. You'll see a vibrant sense of community in one scene, and in the very next scene, stark isolation and loneliness right next to each other. That was life in the Weimar Republic, captured by its greatest artists. Now, some of those works stand out for their incisive condemnation of the society around them. And I think it's important to recognize that it might legitimately call into question somewhat what I've been saying about the premise of the Weimar Republic. A number of the most prominent German expressionists, many of them well represented here, a number of them either fought in the trenches in World War I or served in some other capacity. A couple of them were medics in World War I. When they came back home afterwards, their eyes had seen things that nobody else had. They weren't things that they wanted to see, but they couldn't unsee them. And they came back to a society that had not shared those experiences. And then they came back to a society, the society that they returned to never lived up to its promises. It doesn't mean the promise wasn't real, but it means the promise remained unfulfilled. So in retrospect, I think we could see some of the more drastic examples of Weimar art as an articulation of cultural critique and social protest. These are artworks that reflect feelings of profound alienation and confusion. They depict a world that had stopped making sense because it had for a lot of those artists. We might call it disjointed art for a society that was out of joint. I happen to find those among the most compelling pieces in the exhibit. They deserve our attention. And there's so much more here in those works upstairs. The Weimar years saw an outpouring of imagination, not just in the visual arts, by the way, in music, in literature, in cinema, in pretty much every form of art that you can name. Weimar is sometimes seen as the birth of aesthetic modernism. These were forms of art that were genuinely challenging. That's a word that gets thrown around a lot these days. This was the real thing. Forms of art that were genuinely challenging. These works of art are disconcerting for a reason. Even today, when a lot of the techniques that were first invented back then have now become a part of the everyday aesthetic landscape, they still have the power to shock. Go try it, go see, go look upstairs and see if you agree with me. When you're watching a movie, totally normal, regular, everyday movie. When you're watching a movie and you start to have that feeling of disquiet, something ominous is about to happen, that is a direct inheritance of Weimar cinema. They invented those techniques and they still work. We still fall for them. They're still effective. A century later, it's amazing to me. In a sense, you might say that Weimar's artistic avant-garde, it was almost designed to offend proper traditional tastes. The angles, the colors, the shapes, the intensity of expression, the framing. These are works that defy conventional expectations about what art is supposed to do. That's remarkable. In fact, these are works that expanded the boundaries of what even counts as art. So, yeah, some people found that thoroughly liberating. Some of us still do today. But you know what? Here's the part where I have to get serious. Some people found it horrifying. In fact, they found it degenerated. That's the term they used for it. And in 1933, those people came to power in Germany. And they put a very quick end to the freedoms of the Weimar era. From the Nazi perspective, the Weimar Republic was nothing but a bunch of leftists and Jews running roughshod over the German people and the German nation, sapping its spiritual strength. The Nazis saw Weimar as chaos, as anarchy, as depravity. It was the embodiment of everything that they opposed. We don't always think of Nazi Germany like this, but the way Nazism operated was by building a sense of community through a simultaneous process of inclusion and exclusion. If you were inside the community, whose boundaries were defined by the Nazis, if you were inside that community, you got a lot of benefits and privileges, which helps to account for the enthusiasm with which millions of Germans greeted Hitler's regime. But if you were outside the community, you were in trouble. Along with Jews and leftists, Nazism viewed avant-garde artists as quintessential outsiders. They were outsiders of outsiders. They were fundamentally alien in Nazi eyes to the German spirit. They were a potent threat to German cultures. Nazi officials intended to purify German culture. They wanted to cleanse it of supposedly foreign and corrupting influences. That is how the artists in this exhibit fell afoul of Nazi policy. The logic involved wasn't always that consistent. You could be a rabid anti-Semite. You could in fact even belong to the Nazi party, and that wasn't always sufficient to save your artworks from the fury of the Nazi censors. What I would like us to think about, getting close to finishing my remarks here, what I'd like us to think about is why the Nazi regime reacted so strongly against art of this kind. With a few exceptions, these are not art that has obvious propaganda value. These are not artworks that lend themselves mostly to a straightforward political reading. Most of the artists weren't Jewish, so what got the Nazis so disturbed? And the tentative answer that I want to put forward before I close my remarks and open it up to some discussion, my tentative answer might sound counterintuitive, but I want to suggest that at some level, the Nazis who hated this art were right. What I mean is, art like this is a threat to a totalitarian system such as Nazism. Art like this does represent impulses that can directly undermine any authoritarian project. Art like this points toward a different kind of world, a different kind of society, a different kind of life, one where things like Nazism don't really fit. This art is beautiful, it is confounding, it is provocative, and it is questioning. This is art that asks difficult questions and resists easy answers. It is little wonder that the Nazis had no idea what to do with it. So as we look back on that promising and precarious era from 100 years ago, let's see what questions it has for us. Thank you very much for being here.
That was absolutely incredible. I cannot, that was just spectacular. You're so passionate and animated and incredibly, and obviously,
This art
vastly knowledgeable about this. So thank you, that was incredible. So as Peter said, we would like to open the floor up to some questions. Do we have some questions? To the front row where it is nice.
Was there a geographic distribution between the, should we say, traditionalists of the Weimar Republic and the new wild folks, either urban and country, or north and south, or east and west, or something?
Such a, do you want to collect questions first? You want me to go one
We can go one at a time.
one by one? That is such a great question, and I have to say, I don't know. Does somebody here know that? There are several very knowledgeable people in the room right now. I would say urban, rural, yes, sort of. Not entirely, but yes, but as far as north-south, that is an excellent question. It's a very German historian question that I feel like I ought to know the answer to. And I just don't. I'd have to go look it up. Anybody know that? Right. But were there ones where there were more traditionalists and ones where there were more Dadaists and expressionists?
Much more traditional.
Okay.
Wait, I'm gonna come back here so that people can hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, it was really nice city, and like I said, Cologne is where all the constructivists came from. There's a Siebert upstairs.
Right.
That unit was much more traditional, less avant-garde. Berlin actually had no central theme.
Right, because it was just all.
It was, as you said in your talk. It
Right.
was such a mishmash.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's how it really is divided up. You'll.
I might quibble with the Unipart. For those who don't know you, are you comfortable saying who you are, by the way?
Yeah, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin. Do you mind if I say who you are? Or should I keep that quiet? Kevin is one of the major donors of a whole bunch of the artwork upstairs. I just met him tonight, but he and I have extraordinarily similar tastes in German expressionism. I might quibble with the Munich part. That was fascinating. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yes, for the question and for the input there, Kevin. Okay, I know we had some other hands up here. Coming back, all right.
Was the loss of the Kaiser a great effect on Germany? Did they lose a necessary figurehead, moral compass, or what were the effects of the loss of the Kaiser?
Sure, great question. A huge effect that happened in 1918 already, the very end of the war. Kaiser abdicated and fled to Holland with his family. What effect it had is difficult to tease out. A chunk of the left and the center were indifferent. They would have preferred a republic. They would have been happy with a constitutional monarchy, by the way. Had anybody been able to convince the Kaiser to agree to that, they would have been fine with that. But they were happy to have a republic. And a lot of the people were happier with a republic. What it did lead to was a lot of splits that were never resolved on the right. A chunk of the authoritarian right remained monarchist. I don't know how you say that when there's an emperor involved. What's a monarchist with an emperor? Whatever you call that. And a chunk of the right said, no, he missed his chance, that the Hohenzollern, the family, they had their opportunity, they're washed up. Why move backwards? We have to move forwards and create a new authoritarian structure. That's the strand that the Nazis eventually emerge out of. That's why Hitler's the Führer, and let's not bring back the Kaiser. So it leaves Germany disoriented, but there's no agreement, left, right, or center, on what to do about the disorientation. Do we want to bring back the old order, or do we want to create something new? If we're creating something new, is it more authoritarian, less authoritarian, more democratic, less democratic? That's why it's so hard to have any functioning majority about anything at all for most of those years. That's a great question.
Okay, we're gonna come to our committee member and State Kate's artist in resident, Jeff Semple.
So it's so interesting to hear the many references to the parallels to today, but it always seems to be at a little bit of a distance. It's always mentioned, acknowledged, but we never want to go right there. And I think I'd love to hear any insights or lessons from this creative ecosystem that was happening then that maybe could be just unearthed, even just little ones now for us. And when I say creative ecosystem, I don't just mean the artists, I mean the collectors and the people championing these artists. So yeah.
And the appreciators and
Yes, the
the
appreciators,
audiences.
yeah.
And wonderful question. Keeping in mind, again, this is not just a question of the visual arts. like I said, literature and cinema and music and all those things going on. I would say that, that expanded creative ecosystem really tried hard from an early period, way before 1933, tried to come to terms with what they saw as the various threats to Weimar democracy, most of which they saw as coming from the right, but some of them did come from the left. I didn't mention that so much in my talk, but that was real. That's not imaginary. I'm not sure they came up with particularly effective ways to counter them, but I wouldn't say that's their fault. They did their best to understand where the threat's coming from, how can we respond to them in ways that will appeal to large groups of people who aren't necessarily art nerds. Not that that was a contemporary term in the 1920s, but you all know what I mean. Ways that will appeal to a large group of people who may not necessarily connect with the latest Dada fashions and the latest expressionist whatever. A lot of those artists were trying to simultaneously change the consciousness of people who were attuned to the latest movements in modernist aesthetics and appeal to people who just weren't reachable at quite that level, but were still reachable. And they really tried to work hard to, that's a hard double game to play. That's juggling several balls in the air at once, but they were committed to making it work. And sometimes they came up with fascinating examples of how to do visual art and print it in widely distributed mass form in a responsible way, not a way that's dumbed down, not a way that's oversimplified, not a way that's making simplistic points, that's making complex points in ways that are approachable and accessible to a broad audience. And that stuff impresses me to this day. We have to recognize it didn't work in the sense that it somehow all by itself did not magically stop the march of the Nazis toward power, but man, did they try in some smart and thoughtful and creative ways to do.
Okay, we've got, I'm gonna go back here and then I'll swing back up to the front. We're going all the way to the back level. Good to see.
So I'm wondering if there was any type of central critical force that polarized this anti-art feeling, and then how did that phase into Hitler's position?
I don't think so. I think some Nazis imagined that there was, but the Nazis imagined a lot of things that didn't actually exist. There wasn't much of a central anything in Weimar. The later you get in Weimar, the less there's a central anything at all. There's not even really a center of the political spectrum anymore. It just starts to wither and disappear. The way Hitler figures in, that's a little easier to explain. In fact, one of your posters up there does a terrific, I won't say much about it because upstairs there's an excellent description of that. Hitler was himself a classic example of a frustrated artist, of a failed artist, if you will. He was really bitter about being turned back, not once, but twice, from the Viennese, what was it, the Academy of the Arts? I always forget the details. The Academy of the Arts when he was a younger man. And it wasn't that he lacked talent. You know, if you look at the drawings and paintings that he did, he had the basics down. I would say he lacked any creativity and originality.
Creativity and emotion.
Yeah, that's a good description, Molly.
Very cold.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, anyone with the basic ability, I lack that basic ability myself. I draw like a 5-year-old, but anyone who can, fill the basics could do what Hitler was able to do. And it just didn't get through his head that he did not have what it took. And for the rest of his life, he was mad as hell at the art establishment and the Jews and whoever else he imagined had somehow been behind that disgrace that he had suffered. So sure, you could offer a personalized explanation, but I actually would warn against that. I think it's way too simple for us to ascribe everything that happens under the Nazi regime from 1933 onward to Hitler's peculiar personal obsessions. That's just not how Nazism really functioned. Every once in a while, that could be one part of an explanation, but we should never make that the main one.
Marshall, you got your turn.
I would have to categorize it as art and mixed life. And World War I was horrible. it created casualties and cruelties that had never been witnessed before. And I would say this art reflection is a creative scream, so that you saw artwork that was crazy, completely hard to understand. Dadaism, the artists simply gave up on life. How could we be so cruel to each other? I think that basically is what this period reflects. It's a creative scream.
That's beautiful put.
Can you talk a little bit about the shame that Germany had that probably brought about, they were so shamed by losing the war that they had such patriotism that they turned against the modernists who showed like the Ashcan School in America and some of the other things that were going, that artists were able to do the industrialism and so on.
Wonderful question. I cover this with my students at Marquette. Whenever we talk about World War I, the first thing I point out is you don't start a war you expect to lose. Now, it's controversial to say that Germany started World War I. I think there's a lot of blame to go around. I would blame all five powers for contributing to starting World War I, but Germany and Austria-Hungary carry a large portion of that blame. Germany expected to win the war. They expected to win the war fast. They said they'd be home by Christmas. The war started. Do the math. Nobody expected the war to last as long as it did, to kill as many people as it did. It was a fantastic miscalculation on every side. So yeah, Germans not only had shame from a lost war, they had actual losses from a lost war, lost huge chunks of their territory, lost millions of people. The people who weren't dead, many more came back missing limbs and parts of their psyche, and virtually every family was missing a son or a father or a cousin or a nephew, and so on and so forth. On top of that, they get blamed by the international community. And for what it's worth, I'm not even going to argue right now to the extent to which the blame was justified or not. Germans thought it was unjustified. All Germans, the left, the right, the center, virtually every German was convinced that that blame was not called for and was unfair. So every German, and that's one thing that united Germans in Weimar, we were unfairly blamed for the war. Plus, we have to pay the reparations, which were very, very high, very hard to pay back. All that stuff on top of it, and then you get all this weird making fun of us all the time. I'm really not trying to make any excuses for the anti-art reaction, but you can kind of see what its social origins might have been, what it was feeding on within German society. That's an excellent point.
Okay, we got a question back here.
Did class or socioeconomic status contribute to the perilousness of the Weimar Republic?
Yes and no. In terms of who voted for whom, it's not as nearly as simple as you might think. Working class voters voted across this entire spectrum, far left to far right. Catholic voters are fascinating. There was a Catholic party and it had the support of Catholic workers, Catholic owners, Catholic middle class people. It's a really, really complex topic. Some of the artists represented upstairs came from very humble origins. Others came from effectively noble origins, and almost everything in between. There is a longstanding school of historiography, a school of historical research that tries to trace some of those political trends more closely back to the class origins of either political exponents or the people who voted for various parties. And I have to say, I've never been particularly convinced by that. I think that's too simple. When you look at when you get down into the details, it starts to get really, really, really murky. But that's not at all the same thing as saying that class doesn't matter. Class matters enormously. Class matters today, and class mattered a lot in the 1920s in terms of who had access to what parts of German society. Class was decisive on that score. The extent to which that translated into direct political behavior, that would be a different question.
Okay, we're gonna take two more questions. One here.
I just sort of want to make a little comment about your presentation, which was excellent. And it's this, that the sort of the appearance that anti-Semitism that arose with Hitler, in fact, had foundations that came much earlier than that. He was tapping into something that had been long-term there. So I just would mention that because the presentation, you could, and actually, the reason I'm here today is because of the anti-Semitism that a relative of mine in the distant past experienced in Germany before this. And
Before 33.
yeah, that's another story, but I just thought I would mention.
Want to do one
Okay,
more?
we're gonna do, just come back up to the woman front row for our last question.
Right. I just wanted to know about the role of women artists. You said that Weimar opened up a lot of new spaces and roles for women. Was that true in the art community as well?
It was not as much as we might wish. Some of us might wish, but yes, there are several women artists represented upstairs, and there are more who fit into some of these larger categories that we mentioned, Dada, Expressionism, a few others that who we happen not to have represented in the collection upstairs through no fault of the donors and the curators, but who were important, but minority members of those movements. I would say, going on a bit of a limb here, I would say that was the first point in the major history of those movements where women became a significant, in the German context, became a significant noticeable part of those movements, but they were still heavily outnumbered by the men. But hey.
Were they treated any differently by the reaction?
Yes and no. Sometimes they were ignored. Sometimes was there a special program for women in the 1937 exhibit? Do you remember this, Molly?
I do not. I don't know.
That's such a good question.
There were, looking back, we have the list. I don't think that there was.
Not
that there were
sure.
any women in
I'm
that.
not sure there were any women represented. The Nazis might have shied away from that for their own domestic reasons, like
Possibly.
don't even raise the possibility that women could possibly be involved in this. I'd have to look into that. I have to do the research. Can I very briefly respond to the excellent question before?
Yeah.
You are absolutely right. I barely mentioned anti-Semitism in my talk here at the Jewish Museum. The professor who studies anti-Semitism. There's a reason for that. I won't go into it, but I think you are definitely onto something. That the notion that Hitler somehow invented anti-Semitism, I think every single person in this room knows that that's goofy. What Hitler did do, which is worth pointing out, is take a set of pre-existing prejudices and radicalize them in very extreme ways, and that had fatal consequences. There were millions of Germans who were what you might call everyday anti-Semites, and did not occur to them that Hitler was not an everyday anti-Semite until it was far too late. That is something that historians of Nazism are trying to puzzle their way through for some time now. It's not the sort of thing that usually made it into the kinds of artworks that we are looking at, because it wasn't really all that prominent in the 1920s versions of Nazism. It's the kind of thing that starts to come out well after the Nazis are already in power. Terrific question. Thank you, Molly.
Thank you. We could all listen to you for several more hours. You are just truly, you're just a pleasure to listen to, and incredibly informative, but just a pleasure to listen to as well. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your passion with us. We so appreciate it. And thank you for all the wonderful questions and comments. We have a fabulous